So much for coming. That's all right.
We'll survive.
Did you get lost?
I was looking for water for them.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'll share. I'm sorry.
Put us in a hot room.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to the Community Outreach and Involvement. We have Mary Ann Dunwall here from the Department of Environmental Quality, who's going to be our moderator this afternoon. And would you like to introduce the panelists?
Thanks, Keisha.
Great, thank
I'm
you.
sorry I walked in late. I was looking for water for our panelists, but I think I found where it is. I just wasn't able to get there in time to get back here. So I am Mary Ann Dunwell. I'm with the Department of Environmental Quality. Thanks for joining us for community involvement and outreach at this wonderful conference. Before I introduce our panel of experts, I'd like to ask a favor. If you could save your questions till after the presenters are through, and then we can have a lively, spirited Q&A discussion. So let me catch my breath. I was running up the steps. So it's my pleasure to introduce, first of all, Chris Sircone. Chris, you want to give a little wave there? This is Chris. Chris is currently a senior project manager for Geomatrix Consultants in Missoula here, managing several Brownfields projects in EPA Region 8. He has more than 19 years of environmental consulting experience, 10 years directly related to Brownfields redevelopment. His areas of expertise include brownfield grant writing, site assessment, remedial design and engineering, risk assessment, and public outreach. And Mr. Sircone will be talking about the one emergency incident that occurred at Missoula Sawmill site. So we're interested in hearing about that. And let's see, Diana Hammer. Diana is with us, and Diana has been employed by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency since 1991 and has worked at the national and regional levels. She now works at the state level in her present community involvement position with EPA's office in Helena, Montana. In her tenure at EPA, Diana has worked with communities, local governments, states, and tribal nations on various EPA programs. She was part of EPA's emergency response team to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and for her efforts, she's received numerous awards, including being named by EPA the National Community Involvement Coordinator of the Year. Wow.
What year was that?
And she mentioned a couple years prior, she got
Good
a
work.
couple of regional Community Involvement Coordinator of the Year awards. So we're looking forward to hearing what Diana has to say. She'll be talking about the Milltown site development, a very large Superfund site, and how she works with a very small core group of community folks. And last but not least is Valda Tarbett. Valda is the Deputy Director of the Redevelopment Agency of Salt Lake City, a position that she's held since October of 2001. Ms. Tarbett has worked for the agency for over 36 years, so there's some experience as a senior project manager and operations officer prior to becoming deputy director. She graduated from the University of Utah with an undergraduate degree in finance and a master's of business administration. And Valda will be talking about the Gateway District in Salt Lake City, which many of you have probably heard about, and how that redevelopment and working with communities have led to other redevelopment projects. So without any further ado, I think, Val, if you could go first, please. Thank you.
That would be great. Well, good afternoon. I want to thank you for inviting me to this conference, mostly because I grew up in Fort Benton and Geraldine up on the High Line. And so it's given me a chance to come back and say hello to some old friends and to have a little bit of a vacation on top of speaking at a conference. So thank you. I have been involved with the Redevelopment Agency for 36 years, and probably the biggest projects that we have ever done is the Gateway District project area. And I wanted to start this, and most people this morning have already done this for you, which is to expand your concept of what community really is. Because I think the Gateway development really taught Salt Lake City what community really is. Because most of the time we look at community and we think of it as our community councils and our residents. But you know, our city officials and the staff, our state and federal partners all become a part of the community that makes a project really work and work well. When we started working on development of the Gateway District project area, and I do work for a redevelopment agency, so we are talking about urban renewal project areas that include the power of eminent domain, which brings up a whole another set of issues and fears on the part of property owners in districts. So in 1996, we started working on creating an urban renewal project area in an area that is just immediately west of our downtown area. It was 650 acres of district. It was primarily an area where the railroads did and still do come through Salt Lake City. But it had turned into a very industrial area. It was basically deforested. The public infrastructure was virtually non-existent. And this is 3 blocks west of our downtown. Part of the impetus for us to begin this process was that in 1995, Salt Lake City had gone through a rezoning process for its downtown, and it had changed the zoning east of the State Street area to residential. And so it stopped the encroachment of office buildings into that historic residential neighborhood. So the only way we could grow our downtown was to the west. But it was cut off by an I-15 runs through that part of town, the railroads run through that part of town, and we needed to find a way in order to make that land developable again. While I spent about a year meeting with every single property owner, wandering around the streets with my blight survey team, who included our environmental assessment folks, a building assessment, we had police and fire, a group about 10 of us going door to door basically in a commercial district and meeting with every single project or property owner that we could convince to talk to us. There were other folks in the office who were beginning to build these other partnerships to make this project area work. Salt Lake City started a process of redoing the master plan for the district and rezoning it from industrial and manufacturing into a more commercial sort of zoning. The blight survey actually provided a substantial amount of information for that rezoning process because they weren't rezoning this area for a residential use if while we were out wandering around the streets we found it was environmentally contaminated. In this district we have plating companies and other manufacturing sorts of uses that would not, a good next use was not residential. And by virtue of us spending that first year out there looking at the grounds, we didn't have a master plan that wasn't doable. We also held lots of meetings with the property owners, not only individually but in groups, so that we could answer their questions about what this meant for them and their businesses if they wanted to remain there. We had another person who started working with EPA, and we became a pilot showcase community, and then on to becoming one of the original 16 showcase communities for EPA. And it is because of that background work that we ended up with a project and a project area that has truly been very successful. But I would tell you that sitting here today, that we could not have done it without the cooperation of a whole lot of agencies and a whole lot of interested parties in our community and in the region. One of the projects that came out of this redevelopment effort was our 500 West Park Block project. And the photo on your left, I gotta get that right, on your left was basically what this area looked like in early 1998. And the other photograph is a 2001, well, spring of 2002 photograph. So in 4 short years, we were able to basically get the Gateway project up and running. Now, I would like to say it was all because of our hard work and all of those efforts, but you seem to remember that Salt Lake City had this small event that made us want to get these things done as quickly as possible. In the case of the 500 West Park Block project, we had a lot of partners. We had our property owners agreed to an SID. Senators Hatch and Bennett worked to get us some special allocations of funds. EPA, EDA, and HUD all gave us money to accomplish this 500 West Park Block project. Salt Lake City sold bonds, and the redevelopment agency is actually making the debt service payments on those bonds. That single project cost about $18 million. But at the end of the day, what we have is we have an industrial area that had absolutely no green space in it at all. And now we had created this green space corridor for the new office workers and the retail workers and the residences that are located along that block. What I would tell you is that, it's not a very good picture, but the buildings that you see here are all residential, which was, at the time we opened this district, there were 17 single-family residential properties in the 170 acres of the Depot District. And in that one building alone, there were 350 units, some of which were affordable, tax credit housing, and some of which are just market rate housing. Another project that came not long after this is about a block and a half north of the Gateway project, and this has been, this is about a 168 unit mixed use residential project. It's 60% tax credit housing and 40% market rate. It has some retail on the first floor. And here we developed some other partnerships. One is Neighborhood Housing Services, which is one of our local nonprofits. There are tax credit partners on this because this was a tax credit, low-income housing tax credit deal. And then the agency gave them about $500,000 to build a structure for their parking. And the reason that structured parking was important for these residential projects is that we figured out that as close to downtown as we are, we needed to have a better use of our land in densities than surface parking lots. So we are, as an agency, are a big promoter of structured parking. And while we were doing the rest of it, one of our city council members discovered an abandoned gas station on one of the corners in his neighborhood. And he said, well, while you've got the relationship with EPA and DEQ, don't you think you could do something about this abandoned gas station? So we got another staff member and we went to work on this gas station. Our partner in this particular case was our State Department of Environmental Quality, who helped us remove tanks and do testing on all of that. We cleaned it to a level where you could have, it was still commercial, so we did a live-work sort of situation. We have commercial on the first floor, and we have a residential unit above, each one about 1,200 square feet, and we sold it as a twin home, basically as a condominium. But without, again, our partners of the city to help us rezone it a little so we could do the live-work situation. Neighborhood Housing Services, again, was our partner in the construction. And then the agency provided the construction loan. And for $350,000 in cost, we ended up with about $500,000 worth of reinvestment in the community by the time the units were sold. And while working on Gateway, then the downtown Main Street owners started to say, well, geez, if we don't start cleaning up our own act, we have to compete with Gateway, which was all brand new. So the downtown business owners decided maybe we ought to do a little bit of renovation on our own businesses so that we can keep the tenants we have. So we also do some commercial renovation. Our partners in this case end up being the State Historical Society because these are very old buildings and they helped us through the process to make sure that the money we lent folks was appropriately used to restore those buildings. But we not only did the facades, we did the interiors of those buildings. Because to have a pretty face is one thing, but you've got to be leasable at the end of the day. And so our partners here ended up being the Historical Society, the property owners who took loans, and these were all loans, they're below market, but they are loans, and then the agency who was the lender. An interesting thing about the loan programs that we use, we only loan them half of the money that they need in order to do the work. The other half has to either come out of pocket or from a private lender. Our city council is very concerned about competing directly with banks and having the other banks be the partners. In these two buildings that I'm showing you, or just showed you, the owners actually put their half in cash. They had owned the buildings free and clear, and so they really didn't need to go to the bank to borrow the money. And then came the other residential developments. Because Gateway worked so well, other developers began talking to us about residential developments in our downtown. This particular site is one that the agency owned, and we had basically owned it for over 20 years, trying to get a residential development started here. Several years ago, we built a brand new city library, which is state-of-the-art and has been written up in all the library magazines because it's really kind of a cool design. But this site is kitty corner from that. It's a half a block from light rail. It's a half a block from my office. And we got a developer who was finally willing to do this by saying, oh, if private development doesn't step up and do this development on this site, the agency will. And it got to the point where the developer said, we don't want a redevelopment agency competing with us in the private market because they have a different cost of capital, they have a different goal in mind, and we don't want to compete with the government in a residential development. This development has been a huge success. It's just been finished up this summer. There's 117 units, so this is basically a medium density development. It's 7 stories. Excuse me. 102 of the units were sold prior to the time the certificate of occupancy was issued. In 6 weeks, they closed over 90 of those loans. The first mortgage lender is now paid off. The agency also loaned money on this to the tune of about $10 million. We're very close to being paid off. The units involved in this thing are studios, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. Average costs per square foot range from $250, and there's one in there for $530 a square foot, which is absolutely unknown in our market. Our market is mostly in that $300 a square foot range. Our partners in this are the developer who ultimately built this, which is Wood Development. There is a state office building that sits immediately to the north of this building. They needed 250 parking stalls. So we actually built 2 levels of underground parking under this facility for the state of Utah. And then there's 2 levels of parking for the residents. And then the residential development is on top of that. So it has been a great cooperative effort. The state got what they wanted. We're waiting to see how things work with the condominium HOA in the state of Utah. I hopefully won't be involved in that. I don't want to think about that. The Gateway project is the one that we are probably best known for. It is a Phoenix Award winner for a lot of reasons, in that we worked really hard to get this development done, and it has made such a huge difference in our community. Basically, in the fall of 1999, and the building that you see on the left is our Union Pacific Depot. And it actually had been owned by the state of Utah for a lot of years, and the state didn't have a lot of money to invest in that building. When we got in and you can see they're starting to do the excavation here, what they found out, it was on wood piers. And so the developer actually took title to the building and put a foundation under it, which is probably very good, and then did a renovation of the historic depot. It is in private ownership now, but it does have perpetual public easements on it to maintain it as a public building for basically the rest of its life. In 2 years, the Boyer Company built the initial phase of the gateway. There were about 350 residential units, about 500,000 square feet of office, about 600,000 square feet of retail. A public street had been constructed through the middle of the project, and we opened this just prior to the 2002 Olympics. We got some special help with our tax credit partners. The housing that was initially built here was used for the news media for the 2002 games. But basically, in a tax credit deal, you have to have brand new housing to be tax credit eligible. And we did manage to get a special dispensation, so it didn't have to be brand new. Basically, and this was a $325 million project when it came out of the ground initially. Since then, Boyer has added more office, more retail, and 150 condominium units to this project, and will continue to build. At the beginning of the life of this project area, the taxable value in the district was $27 million. Thank you very much. Today, or at the end of the 2000 tax year, it was $425 million, which generates about $5 million a year in property taxes, of which the agency takes about 3/4 for reinvestment into the district. And the rest of it goes out to the taxing entities for schools, the city, the county, the library, all of those. The thing that I think has made us successful as we have worked through these projects is because we did the master plan, we had a clear idea of the goal that we wanted to accomplish. We were willing to look for different ways to accomplish that goals. We didn't have tunnel vision where we saw only one way to accomplish things. We were willing to let EPA or DEQ or our communities talked about some variations to our theme of what we wanted to see happen. We were willing to share the credit for accomplishing these goals. We didn't do it all. Without our partners, we would not have accomplished anything. And finally, we were willing to follow through with our commitments, whether that's our quarterly reports to EPA or the meetings that we needed to attend for our state DEQ, or whatever it took, we followed through with the commitments we made to make that happen. I would tell you that we haven't stopped at where these pictures show you. I mean, this last year we started commuter rail in our community from the north down, from the communities about 80 miles north. We have expanded our TRAX line to our intermodal hub, which now is in this district as well, and includes Greyhound, Amtrak, commuter rail, and light rail. Taxis are always there, so it's not hard to get a taxi there either. But we are continuing, and we're continuing to see a whole lot of investment by our private developers because they see the advantages. That's it. How do you do?
Chris, you ready?
I'm ready. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Sircone, and I currently work for AMEC Geomatrix, and I had the privilege of being asked to give a presentation today, and I thought about it for quite a while, and they asked me to give you a presentation on public outreach, and I thought, well, sounds kind of boring, kind of maybe. So thought long and hard, and I don't think this talk's very boring, so here we go. Before I do that, though, I wanted to make sure everybody knew that for those that might be in town later this evening, 6:15 over at Higgins Alley, which is on Higgins near break espresso there. We're going to have a little social with some wine and beer and pizza, and you're more than welcome to come if you're going to be in town. So I welcome you to come to that. This story I'm going to tell you is in some ways kind of a lot of lessons learned. I'm going to talk about a large fire that occurred on the Missoula sawmill site that really took the breath out of a lot of people. It caused a lot of concern in the community. And one of the things that I think was amazing about it was the community outreach that was done in relation to responding to the fire, I think was kind of innovative, and it was a key to the successful cleanup of this particular thing. It's also a lesson in having large brownfield sites in your community that remain vacant for a very long time, that tend to attract people that need to have some kind of housing, and often that can result in fires that occur. And so with that, this is a photo taken on August 15th, 2005, taken by myself, and I had absolutely no idea that that night this building would burn down. In fact, there's a kind of a good story about this, and that after the response, the main response was done, I was sitting in my office, and this gentleman came into my office in a suit jacket and a tie, and he asked me if I was Chris Cohen, and I said, yeah. And he asked me where I was on the night of August 15th, 2005. And I said, well, I was home. I don't know where I was on August 15th, 2005. He said, well, I figured it out on paper, and you're the only party that I know that benefited from the fire. Okay, so I'm a detective with the sheriff's office, and I need to do my job, and so for a little while I was a suspect, I guess, for this particular fire, and we did benefit financially from the cleanup of the fire. But thought that was kind of interesting. This is what it looked like the next morning. The fire gutted the entire building. It started about 1 o'clock in the morning. By the time the fire department got there, it was raging. This building is very large, or was very large. It's roughly about 1.5 acres in size. It was a wood timbered building, big beams, and unfortunately those beams were slated to be reused by MRP in the process, and unfortunately they burned down. Originally it was a crime scene. There was concern that someone might be in the building and may have perished, and as you can see, what happened is the roof pretty much collapsed on top of the building, and so for the big part of the cleanup initially around the building itself, there was concern someone had died, and so it took a while to go through that. But what the fire did is that, and this slide I only wanted to show you where that building used to be located. And if you go on the tour, you'll see a bunch of concrete piled up, and the building was right here. There's where the baseball stadium, when this photo is done, being built. It's the Clark Fork River, and we're kind of over here in the community, not too far from where this site is. When we initially got there, I remember Kevin Meady of MRP calling me and saying, Chris, you got to come down and see this. And when I got there, it was quite amazing. There was ash debris scattered 1.5 miles from the project site, and about 1 mile wide throughout the neighborhood. In the yards, and in that area, we're not talking about just like somebody's yard. We're talking about daycares, schools, people that tend to collect cars, and fenced off areas. Everything you could imagine, and it's scattered all over it. And the issue was there was asbestos in the building, okay? And there was asbestos primarily in the roof felt. So the entire building had an asbestos roof felt in the roof. And when the fire went up, it just mobilized that roof felt and spread it all over the neighborhood. So what do you do with something like that? You're called to come out there and figure out how to clean this up. The neighborhood's obviously concerned, and a big deal. It's all over the news. And what I can tell you is in 12 days with 60 workers, we cleaned up the entire area. And part of that was, a main part of it was interfacing with the community, in particular with the city county health department, to do a number of things to address community concerns. And these were our major objectives: to do aggressive public outreach, to ensure health and safety of the community and workers, and to obviously clean up the site. But those first two are the most important ones because those are the most pressing right after the fire. I mean, you can go out and clean it up, but you can do that a week later. But right away, people are generally afraid. They don't know if they should mow their lawns. They don't know if they should let their kids out. So we need to get out information quickly, accurately, and do it as fast as we could. So one of the first things we did was we partnered with the health department, and they agreed to develop a flyer describing the situation, what the risks are related to asbestos, how to do safe cleanup, because there was no way we were going to be able to clean up 1.5 miles within a few days. Somebody's going to mow their lawn. Somebody's going to go out and walk into their street. So what should they do? So we gave them information on how to do that. We also created a repository for certified asbestos bags for people that were doing some of that, where they could go get a bag, they could bag up their yard clippings if they wanted, they could bring them back to the site and we would properly dispose of them. And so that was successful. They immediately created a website specific to this particular fire, and they posted updates. You could see how we were marching through the neighborhood. This is where we were on Tuesday. This is where we're going to be on Wednesday. This is where we're going to be on Thursday. So people could get a sense when we're going to get to them. And the last thing they did, which I think was kind of, in some ways, the most frustrating, but we wanted to have a process by which we could address somebody calling that was, the squeaky wheel, if you want to call it, or was truly afraid, that we could get that call and respond to them as quickly as possible. So we created a hotline number. They could call, they could ask questions, they could say, I'm so-and-so, I need you to get here. I'm so-and-so at Sussex School, and all the parents are coming for, parent-teacher conferences, and can you do us before you do somebody else? Those kind of things. So how do we keep people informed? Well, there was a number of different ways. We went, one of the most things we were visible. We had, like I said, 60 people. We ramped up within 24 to 48 hours, 60 people, and going yard to yard. And I'll describe a little bit how we did it, which was kind of an interesting discussion all in itself. But we kept people informed by going door to door. They could see us. We were visible in the community. We also had, with a goal to respond to any hotline call within 2 hours, and I think we did a good job of that. We had a tiger team that had nothing to do day to day but respond to calls, and they got about 20 a day. We had 2 public meetings at the Ram Loyola Center in the first week to give people a sense of what's going on. We had daily media interviews until it was old news, pretty much, until something else juicier happened. And we had progress updates on the television. We had 9 articles in the Missoulian. This is over a couple-week period. And again, we used that website to post where we were as we marched across doing it. So how do we clean it up? How do we actually tackle this thing? And because there really isn't although I did find one article in Britain where a similar fire occurred and they had a similar situation where after this was done and cleaned it up, that I thought was interesting. But there really wasn't a model to use to how do you tackle this problem. But the things that we did do was we needed to quickly assess where the asbestos was and where it wasn't. And we needed to make sure we monitored ambient air so that we could demonstrate to people living in the community around there that they weren't being exposed to asbestos. We needed to monitor workers to make sure they weren't being overexposed, and if they were, they had to wear appropriate protective equipment. And we needed to clean it up as fast as we could clean it up, because the longer it sat there, the more it was visible, and the more it would be a concern to the community, and the more it would be a concern for the development and the whole Brownfield project. And again, we had a tiger team, and one of the biggest things we did was we immediately went to the city also and said, hey, can we get a street sweeper here to just work these streets for 2 weeks, just sweep them, keep sweeping them and sweeping them and sweeping them. so we could pick up anything that was on the roads, and they graciously agreed to do such a thing. So that was also instrumental. This just shows you the locations of the samples that were collected of debris that came out from the fire, and you can see kind of in the right-hand column where the site is, where the building was. The red dots represent samples that came back positive, and the orange dots represent samples that came back suspect with asbestos, and the yellow ones came back without asbestos. And so from that, what we generated was a map as to how to approach it. And in the pink area, that was our primary cleanup area. We went door to door at each one of these yards, and if they weren't home, we left a note. They had to call us so that we could come back to their door. With that, I'll explain a little bit how we did access and them agreeing to access and all that, because that was a big component of it. In the blue area was areas where we did a visual inspection of the property again, and if we saw any evidence of what looked like asbestos, which happens to look a little different than normal ash, then we cleaned it up. If we didn't see it, then we didn't. And in the yellow area, we left it as, we wouldn't do it, but if somebody called in that area, we would go to their place and do it. So that's how we define the area. As far as sampling, there were 65 samples collected in ambient air at 34 different locations, and none of them contained asbestos above background levels. And in personal air monitoring sampling demonstrated that the folks didn't even need to be in PPE, that they could actually use just breathe normal air. But we still had PPE. We still had people wearing respirators when they were doing the cleanup, just to be protective. And this shows just a slide of where the air samples were collected throughout the neighborhood to get that data by which to give some people a sense that it was safe to be able to wander around. So how did we do it? Again, we went door to door. We had a form, a simple access agreement that gave us access to come in. And also on that form, it checked off when we were done and the owner signed it. This was the hardest part, was going to each one of those different properties, and they all were different. I distinctly remember the first day in the first yard. And we had about 6 guys then, because we were just ramping up, and we went through the yard. It was one of the worst impacted properties. And we spent about 3 hours just picking up everything in the yard, and I'll show another piece of equipment we used, a big vac truck. And we got done, and that afternoon we're standing there all like really proud of ourselves. You know, we got one of them done, 1 yard done. And a little kind of thunderstorm kind of came through, and the wind blew, and it was all in the trees. Everything just fell right down on the site again. It was just the most demoralizing thing you can imagine. But what it did was it made us think, how the hell are we going to do this? And so this is one thing that we used. We used lawnmowers with sweepers on the back of them. We got about 15 of these things. And in lots like this that were easily developed, in yards, that was a good way to do it. You could pull it behind, we could sweep it up, we could clean it up, and it was very, very effective. In weeded lots with cars, it was just painstakingly slow, and that's what really slowed us down. The paved surfaces were actually pretty easy. We used street sweepers by the city, and we also had our own street sweepers that worked parking lots and driveways if they could, but these were also instrumental. These came down from Libya, actually. There was 3 or 4 of these. We brought them down. These were great for doing downspouts for gutters, doing tight spaces that were paved. You could quickly just vacuum it up. Big flat roofs like the West Side Bowling Alley that has, it's probably an acre-sized building. It's a big flat roof. You could get up on there and you could essentially vacuum their roof relatively quickly. So these were instrumental in getting it done. So in the end, 12 days we did the whole thing. What I will say is there was quite a bit of follow-up beyond this. We were required to, by the DEQ, that when we were done, we were required to sample. And I didn't talk about the cleanup on the site. If folks have questions about that, I can talk about that. But this really tied into the public outreach, was the going out in the community. But we had to sample around the building, multiple samples around the building. We had to sample throughout the whole neighborhood. We had to distinctly go to downspouts, soil below downspouts of people's yards, and demonstrate there was no asbestos out there in the neighborhood. And we did that. We sampled all the soil. Soil came back in with no asbestos, and we were able to demonstrate we cleaned it up. But the key to it, I think, was the information we were able to get to people quickly, and the things we did with coordinating with the health department, doing the public meetings, the interviews. You know, you get tired of giving interviews all the time, but it's really, really important. We provided project updates on our cleanup, and one of the best things was people could call in. They could call in and say, I need someone to come, and we could respond. And we responded to 206 hotline callers by the Tiger team in that 12 days. The other thing that I think that was really good was we gave, you know, first of all, there's some people that don't want anything to do with government coming on their property, especially in Montana. They just don't want it. So how are you going to address trying to protect them, and how are you going to try to help clean up their properties? Well, we came up with this idea, well, let's just give them the information of how to do it, you know, and give them the bags, and then they can bring they don't have to worry about the disposal. All they got to do is bring it back to us, and we'll properly dispose it at the landfill up on the hill. So we implemented that, and we went to a local business, Red's Towing, right, you know, on Russell Street, and that's where you could go get the bags. And so everybody knew where to go get the bags, and so that was really, I think, really effective. We comprehensively tested the community impact, which was really important, because at first everybody was really worried, and then after a few days when we had data right away, they could see that maybe this thing wasn't going to be as big a deal, and it also alleviated the media attention after a while. And then the other thing is we were just there. They could see us working it. They could see us out there doing it. And those are the things I think that were instrumental in getting the project done. And something that could have really created a major, major problem for the mill site development, it really turned out to be a really kind of a positive project that MRP was instrumental in. Actually, the folks that owned the building wasn't MRP, so they took the main responsibility of doing the cleanup. It was actually the people that owned the building, which is another lesson learned. If you're working on a brownfield site and you're working with a developer or somebody that might own the building, you should make sure they maintain insurance on those buildings, even if they're old and dilapidated, because in this case, there was no insurance, and they ended up having to pay the whole bill to clean up the contamination. So with that, that's my talk, and I'll be glad to answer questions later on.
Well, if I can find my presentation, I'd be happy to give it. It was here. It was. Oh, there it is. Oh, great. Right in front of me. Well, I'm, sorry. Thanks. Well, my name is Diana Hammer. I work for the Environmental Protection Agency in Helena. EPA Montana, our main office is in Denver, but we have a small office in Helena. And I'm not going to talk about a fire, but I am going to talk a little bit about the consequences of a big flood that occurred about 100 years ago. So, and I do not think the public involvement is really ever boring, because it's always different. So the title of my talk is From a Hazardous Waste Site to a State Park, Cleaning Up the Milltown Reservoir. Are any of you from Missoula? A few of you? So site I'm going to talk about actually is just east of here, about 7 miles from downtown. And it's a Superfund site. So it's not a brownfield site, but it's very similar. I mean, what we're doing is taking a hazardous waste site and looking at turning it into productive use, which is what brownfields is all about. So it's a very similar process. So we are right here, and so just right east of us at the junction of the Blackfoot River and the Clark Fork River is the Milltown Dam, and that's where the Superfund site is. that we've got Clarkfoot Fork River coming down here, the Blackfoot River, and tiny communities of Milltown and Bonner, right adjacent to the dam. And then this is the dam. It was built in 1908. Took 3 years to construct. Using horses and no power tools. Quite a feat. You can see actually in the reservoir now. You can see where they cut down the timbers to build the dam. It was a rocking timber dam, and then the powerhouse as well. And this is the Milltown Reservoir as it looked for much of the 20th century. Built in 1908, and I'll show you what it looks like today for those of you who aren't familiar. This is a picture of construction of Milltown Dam. Again, horse-drawn, hand-sawed timber. Oops. And then it took 3 years to construct, and they finished construction in January of 1908. June of 1908 came a 500-year flood, nearly wiped out the dam, and I can imagine what they were thinking. So this is you can't even see the dam. The powerhouse barely survived. The dam did survive, but it needed some major reconstruction. But along with that flood, for those of you that know Montana history, that was a heyday of mining. Lots of mining upstream up in Butte. And mining practices back in the turn of the 20th century were not at all what they are today. So we had some consequences of this flood. So here's mining up in Butte. Here's the Clarkfoot River. 120 miles of mine waste came down the river and deposited a lot of it right behind the Milltown Dam. So we had about a 30-foot high dam sedimented in with a lot of mine waste. So brand new, needs some repair. Now it's got some contamination, although we didn't know that at the time. In fact, we didn't learn about it until the 1980s. So this is a picture of the Clarkfoot River coming down through the Deer Lodge Valley, and the white areas are things that we call slickens. The copper is so high that vegetation pretty much won't grow there. So we've got ongoing cleanup along there as well. And here was this resting point, or resting place of a lot of the contamination. So over the century, the contamination in those sediments, arsenic and copper, arsenic moved down through those sediments and contaminated the local groundwater supply. And copper in the sediments would periodically scour out of the reservoir, and copper, even in minute quantities, is toxic to fish. So periodically we'd have a big flow, material would scour out of the reservoir, go downstream and kill fish. And so we saw this over the last century. And then in 1980, Missoula County Health Department was out taking some water samples and noticed that in some of the drinking water wells that they were sampling around Milltown, that the water contained really high levels of arsenic. And arsenic is a human carcinogen, and the drinking water pathway is of special concern. So that's when EPA got involved, and it did become a Superfund site at that point. So I'm just going to talk a little tiny bit about the cleanup. But as part of coming up with the cleanup plan, we talked to the community a lot. We did a lot of community involvement, lots of meetings, public meetings, presentations, fact sheets, sort of pretty general community involvement, but there was a lot of it working with the community. This was a pretty divisive issue for the folks living right around the dam. A lot of folks had some real special memories of the reservoir, learning to fish with their father, their grandfather, and swimming in the reservoir, and it was actually a really pretty place. But the contamination isn't very pretty, and we needed to do something about that. So even before, the decision about whether to take out the dam was quite controversial. We thought about, so we've got this cleanup. We know we're going to clean it up. We know the state's interested in restoring the area. Well, what are we going to have when we're done? So we, even before the decision was made about whether or not to take out the dam, we set up a community working group. We started with some EPA pilot money to look at redevelopment, and we formed a working group, and I'll talk more about the working group and how that worked. But we had a real important ground rule. So in our working group meetings, we would not discuss whether it was a good idea to take out the dam or not, because that would have just sidetracked all of our discussions. So that was a ground rule, and for the most part, we were really good about that. And we decided instead to focus on shared values. Okay, what's important to this working group? What's important to this community? And once the Superfund site is cleaned up, once the pollution's removed and the river's restored, what do we want to have? What's our community vision? So I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we did actually decide to remove the dam and remove the most highly contaminated sediments. And the main cleanup goals are to restore the drinking water supply, restore the fishery, and by taking out the dam, we restore fish passage. And we're actually starting to see fish move up the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot already. So as both Chris and Valda mentioned, they talked a lot about partnerships and collaboration and working together and outreach, and this is really a story of that as well. And I think that's a real theme with community involvement and outreach. It's working together, and this project in particular integrates the cleanup with the restoration and the redevelopment. So we kind of joke about moving the dirt once. If we know where we want to be in the end, and we have that in mind as we do the remediation and the restoration, hopefully we're kind of moving the dirt just once. So we talk about these as the 3 R's. So remediation is the first R. And just really quickly, this is the site. First thing we had to do was protect the contaminated sediments from flooding, so we built berms. We built a bypass channel to divert the Clark Fork River away from contaminated sediments. We put into a clean channel, and then we stockpiled the sediments that were dug, the contaminated sediments that were dug out of the area that became the bypass channel. And we started hauling those sediments away last fall, and we've hauled over 1 million cubic yards. We've got about 2.5 million total, so we're getting close to the halfway point. And so this is powerhouse, and this is the dam. So the first thing we needed to do was remove the powerhouse. And powerhouse was 100 years old, historic, and this working group that we had set up decided that we really wanted to be able to preserve some of the items. It's old Montana power. There were some 1906 GE generators in there, still all but one still functioned. I mean, there were some items that we really want to preserve. So we worked with Northwestern Energy and the working group to make sure that these items were preserved. And then the powerhouse came down really quickly. 3-sided brick structure that we were surprised at how fast it came down. And then the next step was to divert the river and breach the dam. So in late March, we had the governor, 2 senators, and 750 people watching as we breached the Milltown Dam, which was quite a historic event. So for the first time in 100 years, the Clark Fork and Blackfoot rivers were flowing freely. So a lot of folks watching, and an excavator removed the final plug, and then the river started to make its way down through the pilot channel, and it's flowing freely now. 2 days later, this is what it looked like, and that's what it looks like just a couple of weeks ago. So now we're in the process of removing the rest of the dam. So then that was remediation, and now and then next comes restoration. So once the pollution's gone, we want to restore the rivers, and the idea, this is led by the state of Montana, and the idea is to return the rivers into a naturally functioning system. They've done a lot of work studying historical photographs to figure out where the river used to be, and they want to create as natural a system as possible. Want to improve water quality and provide high-quality fish and wildlife habitat. And there'll be recreational opportunities. They'll be different than they were on the reservoir, but there will be other certainly good recreational opportunities. And then they'll be using native vegetation to restore the river. And they have a detailed vegetation plan. And then the third R, which I want to spend most of my time on, is redevelopment. So this community group that we set up, we had about 20 members initially, representing different interest groups. We had folks who really cared about fish. We had folks that were big kayakers. We had folks that were small business owners. We had folks that lived in the area. We tried to represent as many of the interests as possible in forming this working group. And so in 2003, the working group was formed. And asked ourselves, okay, so we've got this area, what do we want to have in the future? EPA provided some support. Missoula County was really supportive. They provided a lot of staff time, and the National Park Service Rivers and Trails program also was very supportive. So there were some early visioning efforts on what kind of what the community wanted, and the working group took that as a base and then talked about, okay, what are our common values, what do we want to see? And we formed some subcommittees initially to look at infrastructure, land use, governance, trails, and then local history. And there's actually this great collection of old photos that you can see some of those great swimsuits. So the purpose of the group was just to explore the options of future land use and present recommendations to the Missoula County Commissioners. And the Missoula County Commissioners actually appointed all the work group members. Folks applied to be on the committee and were selected by the county commissioners, and then we had open monthly meetings. So this started in 2003, and at the time we said 6 months of meetings. Yeah, that'll be it. We're still meeting. But it's really a testament to the commitment of folks in the community. They really believe in this, and they keep coming back for more, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we've accomplished. So we came up with a charter, and we really focused on a collaborative process. You can read this as well as I can, but that was really an important aspect of the working group members, is the ability to maybe put aside personal differences, regardless of how you felt about the dam coming out. Let's focus on creating this vision of the future. We really, a core value was really to keep the area as natural as possible. And we wanted good recreational activities. And an important part, a really important part, was this land is owned by Northwestern Energy, so it's in private hands right now, but a core value that surfaced from the community was we really want to maintain public access. We want to go down there and fish. We want to go down there and boat. We want to watch wildlife. We don't want this gobbled up in some development. We want this to remain in public ownership. So we set up these subcommittees. Just really quickly, community governance one ended up in creating a community council. So the local community does have its own community council, which reports to the Missoula County commissioners. Infrastructure looked at land use, and the working group decided that these are really issues that the community council should deal with, not the working group. So we kind of passed that on as something of interest that maybe they'd like to explore. Land use was also passed on to the community council. Another subcommittee was local history and heritage preservation, and like with the items from the powerhouse, the area has a real rich history. Glacial Lake Missoula, the Mullen Road, Lewis and Clark came through, the Indians Road to the Buffalo. There's such a rich history, leading up to the mining activities with Daly and the Copper Barons, and there's just all this history in this area. And so this group started to look at local history and culture. Oops. And I mentioned this items from the powerhouse. And one of the ways to do that we thought might be to create some sort of visitor center. So that was an idea that was floated in the community. And they're working on a web page to tell the history of the area. Another subcommittee was Parks, Rivers, Trails, and Recreation, and this actually turned out to be the part of the working group invested the most time and energy in. So we held a series of public meetings. We did a lot of outreach and presented a conceptual redevelopment plan to the county commissioners in 2005. And one of the things that we came up with initially was this idea of having a pretty natural river corridor with some picnic tables and things, and made an interpretive center here, right at the confluence. So that was in 2005. We went back to the community and we talked about putting in some of these trails and hooking up, making loop trails, linking into the network of regional bike trails, interest in biking and hiking, equestrian trails, and creating a real nice system of trails. And this was included in the 2005 plan. And so we talked to the community. We went about looking for funding. We wanted to actually build these things. Now that we had this plan, we were able to obtain some funding and started construction of some trails. And then in the fall, last fall, we thought, well, we've done this. Let's further, now that we've got a better idea of what we want and we've have some trails, let's refine our plan. We'll go back out to the community, and we actually held a design workshop. We worked with local landscape architects who volunteered their time. We worked with folks from the State Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We had community members, and over the course of a day and a half, we came up with more detailed designs of what this park could actually look like. If we wanted to maintain and remain in public ownership, how about a state park? That was kind of this dream. And so we spent a day and a half thinking, well, if we're going to make this dream a reality, we really need to make it a little more concrete. So we got community input throughout 2007. We took drawings from the design workshop, and we revised our conceptual redevelopment plan. And it was adopted by the County Commissioners this past July. And some of the things are in the plan. I have my 2-minute warning, so I have to look at but this is our Milltown Park. And it's not official. This is what we're working towards. But the state of Montana is very interested. And they're spending a lot of money restoring the Clark Fork River. So we think this will actually happen. So we're hopeful. But the former reservoir area would be kept very natural. It would have, the river would meander. It would have restored wetlands, some simple trails so you could access it for wildlife viewing. This area, the interpretive center actually wasn't very popular with the public, so we've tabled that. There would be some trails with interpretive signs talking about the rich history, and this whole area is a really important wildlife corridor with animals coming down. There's the 5 valleys here, so lots of wildlife migration. And then the area right around the Blackfoot River would be called the Milltown Gateway, and that actually would be the most developed. Still not very developed, but maybe picnic tables and a few more trails. That's more of a detailed map of what we might see at the gateway and the confluence. So right now, we have a subcommittee working on to move this idea forward. We have ongoing discussions with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and we're working to actually make this a state park, which is pretty exciting. And I think what will probably happen is the working group will kind of go away, and in its place will be a nonprofit, Friends of the Park or something whose mission will be to raise funds to help maintain the state park assuming it is established. So I think this is kind of a story of a community group that is completely empowered. I mean, this whole idea is completely community driven, and EPA assisted, the county assisted, but the members of the working group really said, this is what's important to us, this is the kind of land use we want to see when the project is all done, and now they came up with this vision, and now they're working very hard to make that vision a reality. So I think it's really quite exciting. It'll cost money, so there's a fundraising aspect and a development committee. So now we're working towards this restored confluence. So thank you very much.
Well, I don't know about you folks, but I wrote down a number of questions, so let's have at it. Who wants to go first? Any questions? Yes.
Diane, I think this is a great process. The only question I had is the soil, contaminated soil chip down, the opportunity. Is that correct?
That's right.
Were people in opportunity involved? Was there some community involvement down there since they were sort of the receiving area for this?
We did talk. We certainly did talk to them, and they had an opportunity to be involved in the decision, although about how to do the cleanup and where we would put the soils. And I should mention that initially, the cleanup proposed creating a repository between the Milltown Reservoir area and Missoula, actually really close to the dam. The public hated that idea. So we went back, and actually ARCO, who owns the land where the the soil or the sediments are being applied. ARCO actually proposed sending those materials by rail for use at the Anaconda Smelter Superfund site. So, the folks in Opportunity near there, a lot of them were not at all pleased to get the material. But at the same time, EPA and the Anaconda Deer Lodge County made a decision a bunch of years ago that rather than managing a number of separate small repositories, our preference is to manage one large repository. And so we made the decision to take this sediments from Milltown, haul them by rail, and use them in site reclamation at the Anaconda site. And for those of you that know the Anaconda site, it's the sediments are being taken to Opportunity Ponds, and it's the old dump, basically, of the Anaconda Mining Company. And the contamination levels of that dump are orders of magnitude higher than what we see in Milltown. And what kind of trips people up sometimes is people say, well, if it's so bad at Milltown, why is it okay at Anaconda? And the difference is it's a river system. We have arsenic and copper in basically at the confluence of two major rivers. And it's a really bad place to have arsenic and copper. But if you take the same level of contaminants, you take them out of a river system and you apply it on land, what it does in Anaconda is it helps with dust control. It's rich in organic material. It grows grasses like crazy. I mean, I can show you pictures where we haven't planted anything, and it's just that we've got excavated sediments, and they're green. They have stuff growing all over. So it grows material really well. So we're trying to take a waste material basically at Milltown and use it in some beneficial way at another Superfund site. And it will help establish vegetation at Anaconda and control their dust problem. So, but folks weren't happy. I mean, it's kind of it's Missoula's waste. It should stay there.
Right.
Any other questions? Okay, back in the back.
I just wanted to add, I'm at Weatherby, I'm involved in the Old Sawmill District, and I wanted to follow up with some of the things that Chris said. I was remembering back, it's been a little while, but in the spirit of cooperative entities, making something good happen, I remember back at the time, getting a call in the middle of the night that the fire had broken out, and I just want to say something nice. I think people should know this about Chris and Geomatrix, that they jumped all over this thing. They brought in another specialist in asbestos cleanup. And it was, I don't know, it was at least a week before anybody knew who was working for whom. I mean, we were involved. Chris was a consultant to us, but he was really working to help just make this whole thing happen. And it wasn't for a while before we figured out how anybody was going to get paid for the work and how it was all going to get fixed. And ultimately, the Idaho Timber, a group that had been in kind of an acrimonious relationship with the city, had their arm twisted enough that they stepped forward and paid for it as they should have. But it was just kind of a cool testament to people doing the right thing. I think that was cool. So that's
Thank you.
a compliment to you guys.
Who else?
What's that?
Where did you find the 60 people in such short order to go
We
out
actually,
and projects?
we hired 3 different asbestos abatement companies. So we hired one out of Spokane and one out of Missoula, two out of Missoula that brought crews in. And then we have here at our office here, we have about a dozen people. And the combination of those folks brought up about 60 people. I'd say though, if you looked at all the people that were involved, you looked at health department people and DQ and others, you're probably looking more like 80 to 100 people that were involved during that process.
Did you have to do any health and safety training for them before?
They were all health and
They were
safety
all-
trained
they were all-
before, yeah, and they needed to be health and safety trained.
How did you deal with the people who wanted to help, who showed up to help but might not have been certified or trained?
Well, you know what? We didn't have anybody that wanted to help. Most of them wanted to complain that we weren't going fast enough. But, no, I think, the people that impacted them, I mean, the fire was so large that it actually, it burned a couple structures off the site, or at least burned some roofs. There's if you know the Pink Grizzly, lawn and garden place, and you can buy fireworks there on July 4th, and you can get your Christmas trees there at Christmas. They have a bunch of greenhouses, a bunch of those melted, I mean, the fire was that hot, and when it landed on it, it just burned holes right through their plastic. And so there was some compensation that had to be done by Idaho Timber to landowners. But boy, they were just fairly gracious. I mean, they understood, they knew it was kind of an act of God. And they also understand, and that's one of the things that's really important to remember about brownfields is, and why it's important to revitalize them, is that, it provides a place that, these things happen. We've had people die on the site, we've had fires. This is not the only fire we've had on the site. We've had multiple fires on this site. And so, getting it revitalized in the long range is going to improve the community in a significant way.
Who else? Another question? Sir?
With concern of spreading the asbestos back in the air, who approved of the street sweepers being used for that? Is that common practice?
Well, it's a wet process, so it's not a dry process, and that's the difference. And that's actually the key. When you're cleaning up the asbestos where you're actually brushing pavement or whatever, you need to do it in a wet. And so the street sweepers that were out there, is the same ones they use in the city every day. They essentially come through before they sweep, and they spray the road. I don't know if you've ever seen it around town. And then they come through with the sweeper that sweeps it, and this way it controls the dust. And that's how we did it.
And where did it end up?
It ended up at the landfill. Actually, they brought it back to us on site, and then it went up to the landfill up at BFI, which is a certified asbestos disposal site in Montana.
Another question? Well, I have a question. I wonder, have you ever dealt with partners who say, oh, we don't want to involve the public, they don't know anything, they're not scientists, they don't understand the science, it'll slow up the process? How do you deal with those types of partners that you work with?
I am one of those partners. I can't read those reports.
Okay.
That is not what I do. That's why my relationships with DEQ and EPA are so important, because I need to be able to give someone else one of those reports and say, do I have a problem?
Yeah.
And I mean, you can develop those relationships because they're so important to you. And I love my consultants, and the consultants are great, but I would prefer to hear it from another governmental entity, because that's what I am, to get that second opinion.
I guess I would say that if you don't involve the community upfront and let them know what's happening, they will involve themselves, and then it's a lot more difficult. I mean, if you march merrily along with your nice plans and have everything perfect, and then you announce it to the community and they have no idea what you've been planning, and you just sort of spring it on them, unless they're either asleep or by some miracle they love everything you've thought of, it's going to take you a lot longer. Even though it might seem like it takes a lot longer up front to do the community involvement and have a couple of meetings and spend time with the community and brief commissioners and talk to the mayor and talk to the community. That might seem like it takes a lot of time up front, but I would bet that if you could somehow run a site in parallel, you would find that is time that actually it saves you time in the long run, because you'll know what the community's concerns are early. You can hopefully address them, or if you can't address them, you can at least explain how you tried but you can't, and here's why. And then when you do come out with your plan, they kind of know what to expect, and they can see how you've been listening. And then I would say, if you have people that don't want to do that you should explain that it really is a time saver. It costs you some time, but it's time well spent.
I guess what I would say is that today I don't bump into many people that believe what you indicated. I do think that there is discussions how best to present information and what might be the best media to do that or how to do that. But the idea that, well, we don't want to involve the public in this process, maybe 10 years ago, maybe, but I haven't really, not within the Brownfield community and working with developers I've worked with ever, have said we're not going to involve the public in the process in any shape or form. I also think that, as Diana said, it is really, really important to do it. It can take a lot longer, but in the end, I don't think it's a lot longer, because you need them. You need to give ownership to as many people you can in your project. And so if somebody in the community stands up and says, I want a bench over there, I think benches are great, and you're able to put in benches to your project, they're going to feel like they have some ownership in it. And that's going to be the key to keeping the momentum going and making projects happen. So.
How are we doing on time? We are just at the end of our session. So I'd like a round of applause, please. A 15-minute break. If you have any other questions and you'd like to speak with them, I'm sure they would be willing. And let me know if you need to know or if you want.
We have one thing to add.
One quick thing. I put some handouts. If you want to know more about the Milltown cleanup, or we do a periodic little email newsletter, and there's some copies over there. If you want to sign up or just take a copy, you're welcome.
Good job, guys.
Nice.
Yeah.